Welcome to This Is Getting Old, Moving Towards an Age-Friendly World. I'm your host, Melissa Batchelor, and on today's episode, we're going to be talking about advanced directives for transgender people. So I'm joined today by Ames Simmons. So welcome, Ames. And maybe before we begin, you could just tell people a little bit about yourself and the work that you've been doing.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Melissa. My name is Ames Simmons, and my pronouns are he and him. I teach a transgender seminar at the law school at Duke University, and I'm right now seeking a graduate certificate in LGBT health policy and practice from George Washington University. And advanced directives that we're talking about today are the subject of my capstone. So I'm excited to be here to raise awareness.
And I'm happy that you are here. So I've done a couple of different podcasts about advanced directives. Maybe just briefly describe some of the different advanced directives that you're talking about, and then we'll talk about some reasons why transgender people may not have those in place.
Sure. Advanced directives, this is like an umbrella term for a set of forms that are usually specified in state law. So they could vary by what the forms are called and what the requirements are for signing and witnessing. Those can vary by state law. They usually include a statement of treatment preferences at the end of life, which are sometimes called a living will, that are part of an advanced directive. They also are increasingly including treatment preferences for conditions like dementia that occur before the end of life. Advanced directives also usually contain a healthcare power of attorney, which is a form, again, it might be called different things, that designates a surrogate decision maker or a healthcare agent or a proxy that will make decisions for you in the event that you don't have legal capacity to make those decisions. We talk about this in the law as if you're either on one side where you have cognitive capacity to make decisions and sign documents, or you're on the other side where you don't have capacity. And we know that's not really how dementia and capacity work in real life, that it's more of a spectrum. But in the U.S. system of law that we have right now, a surrogate is who would make decisions if you don't have capacity. There are also some other medical orders that are sometimes part of an advanced directive. They might be called medical orders for scope of treatment or physician orders for life-sustaining treatment. Those are not part of my research because they originate on the authority of a physician or a healthcare provider instead of the patient and a resident. And I'm specifically interested in what patients or residents have the ability to put in place. They can certainly ask their healthcare providers and should be having this conversation if their healthcare providers are not initiating it with them about what they would like those orders to contain. Sometimes do not resuscitate orders are also sort of part of the package of advanced directives, but not the subject of the research that I'm doing at GW.
Right. I think it's important to make that distinction between kind of the legal and the medical side of advanced directives. And I think the other thing that the public often doesn't understand too is with most living wills, they're so generic, they actually aren't helpful documents to us as providers. They might say something about whether you want a feeding tube placed or whether or not you would want like fetal treatments if you were in a vegetative state. But there's a lot of other nuances to care at end of life, and it's not like you can predict everything that will happen. So I think having some guiding principles in your living will is actually more helpful to providers than trying to think through every scenario and what you would want done. So maybe let's first talk about maybe what a lot of people don't have legal advanced directives, but what might be some specific barriers for transgender people not having the legal advanced directives.
You're right that I think the last figure that I saw was only about 1 in 3 people in the U.S. have an advanced directive. And I think even without talking about the specificity of the LGBTQ or trans and non-binary community, that we need to think about the fact that we live in a death-denying culture. It's something people are afraid of and is a taboo subject in a lot of families. And part of, I think, the movement to increase advanced directives is to start having those conversations earlier and to try to demystify them. It can be difficult when you have some family members who are willing to go on this journey with you and others who don't want to think about it. We also know from research, the last that I saw was that people of color in particular are 4 times less likely than white people to have advanced directives. And that can probably complicate the rates in the LGBTQ community and trans and non-binary community. There have been some studies showing recently that LGBTQ people are completing advanced directives at lower rates. And the reason, reading between some of the lines of what people are saying, is doubt that LGBTQ people have that their advanced directive will actually be respected by healthcare providers because of discrimination, and even more fear of discrimination if your advanced directive spells out that you have chosen family. For example, if a provider didn't otherwise know that you were LGBTQ and you somehow outed yourself through an advanced directive, that you might be exposed to even more discrimination. The rates in the trans community are even less than that. Only about 10% of trans people have completed advanced directives. There was a recent study about Medicare reimbursement rates for advanced care planning services among trans people, and it showed that, perhaps not surprisingly because of structural and institutional racism, that Black trans people have the lowest rates of receiving services. And this is particularly of concern because of subjects that we talked about in a previous webinar about the disproportionate risk of dementia among trans people of color. So this is understudied, like many aspects of health among trans and non-binary people. But there can be both philosophical and practical reasons why trans people might not have advanced directives. In some of the research, it shows that trans people who have recently transitioned might have this sense of that they're starting life anew, and that they think of advanced directives as end-of-life measures. If you're just starting your new life as a trans person, you might not be wanting to think about the end of life. There has likewise been research that just came out showing that if we consider the rates of violence toward trans people, some trans people said they just never thought they would live long enough to grow old and to need an advanced directive. I think there also are some really practical considerations that I'm trying to think about how to work through. Like, for one thing, trans people would just maybe more focused on immediate basic necessities like housing and food and how to get through the day. And that makes focusing on the future more difficult. And I also think it can be, folks who work with trans people on advanced directives have told me that it can be difficult for trans people to be able to identify someone to serve as a healthcare agent. We know generally that LGBTQ people's support networks are thinner than the heterosexual and cisgender population. So that can, unless you're thinking deliberately earlier on in life about who you trust to make healthcare decisions for you, it might be difficult for you to identify that person. And even if you didn't have someone, I'm hopeful that maybe there'll be projects in the future that maybe try to match intergenerationally, match trans and non-binary younger people with trans older people to help make those decisions when there's not someone like that already in a trans person's life.
Right. And so I think you just listed some of the reasons why it would be important for this population to have advanced directives. So maybe now let's shift to talk a little bit about so if you're going to prepare your advanced directives, like your living will and your healthcare power of attorney, what are some of the things that should be in those documents that maybe aren't now? And how would that benefit someone to making sure that you do have those documents in place?
I think it's especially important for trans people to think about and to designate who they want to be part of their care, whether it's dementia care or end-of-life care. Pretty much, many states have a default decision maker that's specified by the state statute, and it invariably is family of origin or people who are related to you by blood or marriage. So if you don't designate someone to receive information, to be able to visit you, to be able to make decisions about you, healthcare providers are going to default to your family members. So it's most frequently the first people on the list are your parents or your children. States vary as to which of those comes first, but it's invariably one of those two parties. And then it goes to like aunts and nieces and, again, people who may be more distantly related to you than your chosen family. And those folks may not be accepting of a trans or non-binary person's identity. And it's not hard to foresee a situation where an unsupportive family member might take charge of medical decision-making to the detriment of a trans person's gender identity. And if you're a provider who isn't sure about what to do in the event that you have a trans or non-binary person who's experiencing increasing cognitive decline, they might be persuaded by non-affirming family members that the person is not transgender. So I think trans people need to think about, again, about talking about visitation, who they want to be able to visit them. I think they need to execute HIPAA releases. So these are medical privacy releases that at least will enable providers to talk to people that you want to have information about your condition. And importantly, in this healthcare agent or healthcare power of attorney, to designate a decision maker. So I think some of the questions that providers might be having to grapple with are like, how should a staff member address the needs of a trans person who no longer remembers that they have transitioned? These are some questions that were identified by Taryn Witten, who is a long-time researcher of aging and transgender people. How should staff members deal with situations where residents or family members are not accepting or supportive of the trans person's gender identity? And which gender identity, if their gender identity has shifted either because of dementia or other factors, which gender identity should be recognized and validated? And this is where I think that advanced directives can be one tool that can help providers with that decision making. Like you said, I think it's important for it to be a values first discussion that you have with a provider, because you won't be able to address every situation, especially given the little research that we have about the trans and non-binary community. But I think this can be a starting place for trans and non-binary people to have a conversation with their providers about what they expect and want and value if they lose capacity.
Right. And I think that's important for all populations. The living wills right now don't really ask you that much about what you actually value. Is it about autonomy? Is it respect for you as a person in the moment, or holding on to who you were prior? And all those things are pretty complicated situations to navigate. But the more conversations you have with your care team, and particularly your medical, whoever would be your medical decision maker if you were to lose capacity, that's going to be important. So, and thinking through, like, based on that values type approach, like, what are some other things that people should be thinking about when they're providing? So, like, what else? So not only the providers, but people on your care partner team.
I think it's important from an ethics perspective for us to be prioritizing autonomy and self-determination in decision-making as much as we can. I think the model of supported decision-making sometimes is weighted more toward the support than it is to the person who's having the decisions made for them. But for trans people, I think what we should be thinking about with an advanced directive is, if you want to specify whether you want to continue receiving gender-affirming healthcare, and whether you want your gender expression that you have currently to continue if you lose capacity to make sure that to take care of those things for yourself, and that you can designate, like you said, an agent who can help ensure that those family interlopers or discriminatory healthcare providers don't get in the way But I think when we are thinking about patient-centered care, and particularly in the context of Alzheimer's disease, the standards of care call for meeting the person where they are that day. And so if you are a trans person who is very binary, like I consider myself to be a man, I have an M on all of my identification documents, even though an X gender marker is available where I live here in DC. Not everybody, I do think I have a less binary gender expression than a lot of trans men. So I am okay with maybe more gender fluidity in my gender expression than a lot of transgender men. But I think trans people need to think about that, and particularly in the context of how accepting would they be of increased gender fluidity in their gender expression, or do they just really feel like I've worked hard to make this gender transition, I've had to overcome so many obstacles, and it's very important to me that my gender identity is respected no matter what, in the event that I lose capacity. So, if you are a person who is non-binary, for example, or again, if you're a trans person who's comfortable with more gender fluidity, you might not want to be bound in the future by gender expectations that you had historically, like when you completed an advanced directive. So you need to think about how this would play out in the event of increased gender fluidity in the case of Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia. I think there's some ability to meet people where they are, like the person-centered standards of care require. If providers have a range of clothing that's available, some that's traditionally masculine, some that's traditionally feminine, and some that is gender neutral. They have hair products, grooming products, makeup, for example, that is available. People may be able to use a different name and pronoun and present or express their gender different from day to day and have that meet the person-centered standards of care. Where I think it gets a little unclear with the laws in the US is continuing medical treatment. So you can't really, at least the research that we have so far does not indicate that you could just start and stop hormone therapy, for example. There may be other like post-surgical treatments or procedures like dilation for trans women that they may have to continue that lifelong, and you may not be able to stop these dilation procedures and then just be able to start them again. If you're receiving gender-affirming medical treatment, I think that you need to take that into account as well when you're completing your advanced directive, because your providers are going to likely need some direction from you about what you think is most important in that situation. And so that's why my project has been to develop guiding questions for trans and non-binary people to be able to think through some of these questions about the gender binary and fluidity, and try to start identifying, at least from a values perspective, of what might be important to us in the event that we lose cognitive decline, so that we can try the best we can to preserve those wishes about treatment in an advanced directive, including directions to your healthcare agent.
Right. And I think all of that is great advice, and it is something that people should be thinking about. And regardless of who you are, what is your value? What are things that you value, so that we can provide the individualized care that you would want, and have those guiding principles to help make those decisions on your behalf if you were to lose capacity. If someone wanted to learn more or to try to find some resources to help them with this thinking and getting these documents together, what are some resources that people can check out?
So if you were a provider, I think one place to start is looking at the Medicare guidelines around advanced care planning. Since 2017, Medicare has reimbursed providers for 30-minute services around advanced care planning, which can include discussing forms and, to a limited degree, assisting patients with completing forms. So there are some resources that Medicare has made available.
And again, that is because we started the podcast talking about medical versus legal. So as a healthcare provider, it's just making sure that it's on your radar and to say, do you have a living will? Do you have a healthcare power of attorney? Versus like you said at the top of this, like the attorney wouldn't do the do not resuscitate, and the physician's not going to help you, or the provider's not going to help you with your living will. But it is important for providers to be asking people, are these things in place, and do they express the values and the things that you prioritize? And so just to make that distinction. Yeah, because Medicare is not going to do the living will, but it would make sure that all that conversation is had.
I definitely recommend that folks look at Medicare.gov and what is covered or not covered there. If you're a trans person, I think some of the places that you can look, Transgender Law Center has a life planning documents resource that I think is very good about explaining what the different types of advanced directives are and helping trans people begin to think through some of these questions about their values, about preserving gender identity. Compassion and Choices is another group. They have an LGBTQ engagement project where they're specifically outreaching to LGBTQ people about raising awareness about the importance of advanced directives. I also recommend that folks look at services like the Care Plan, which is an organization in Chicago that is geared toward helping LGBTQ people with making care and treatment decisions at the end of life. And this can include advocacy work like healthcare agents. I hope that we see more organizations like the Care Plan that are springing up to help LGBTQ and particularly trans and non-binary people of color in this space to help try to address some of the gaps that structural and institutional racism have put in the way of trans and non-binary people being able to make these decisions. SAGE also has some resources on these topics at the National Center for LGBTQ plus Aging that I recommend.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here today and having this conversation with me. If you missed it, please be sure you check out the first podcast that I did with Ames, where we talked about Alzheimer's disease and transgender people. I'll have links in the show notes as well as the blog on my website, melissabphd.com, for the Transgender Law Center, Compassion and Choices, and the Care Plan. And I wish you all the best with your work and can't wait to see some of the great things that you do. And if someone wanted to get in touch with you, how could they do that? And then any final words or thoughts?
Sure. Folks can reach out to me at simmons@law.duke.edu if you have questions or want to get more information. I'm hoping to be able to finish up this guiding questions resource and have it available for people to use at the end of my certificate program, which is in May. So I'm looking forward to that in the very near future.
All right. Well, me too. And please be sure to send me a copy of anything that you publish. And thank you very much for the work that you're doing and for helping raise awareness about this important topic.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you for everything that you are doing to raise awareness and for having me on to talk about this.
Thank you for tuning in to This is Getting Old, Moving Towards an Age-Friendly World. I'm your host, Melissa Batchelor. And if you'd like to learn more, you can check out my other episodes on my YouTube channel by subscribing and ringing the bell to get immediate notifications when new content comes out. In addition, you can also find the audio version of the podcast on Amazon Music, Spotify, iTunes, and Stitcher. Please feel free to leave an honest review because more reviews mean more awareness of the podcast and helps us move towards an age-friendly world. If you have a comment or a question, you can visit my website, melissabphd.com. Go to the Contact Melissa tab, and you can leave me a voice message. You never know, it might just include your question or your comment in an upcoming episode.